What every concerned citizen wants to know, the untold story behind the Iran Contra affair.
After the years of fighting in the trenches against the Contra supporters here in the U.S., it's finally time for the American people to find out who they are, what they've been doing, and what it is that's going to result in their going to federal prison.
I think that President Reagan is lying to the public. I think that he knew all about the Contra affair where the money was going from the Iran deal. And I think it should be opened up to the public. I don't think Oliver North has told the whole story.
The fact that somebody like Oliver North can get away with destroying most of the evidence and the rest of the United States just sort of looks the other way is very disappointing. So I'm very glad to see that somebody's looking into this further.
I think Oliver North's statements were valid, but I think he was put up to it. I think he used I liked Oliver North. I thought he did but he was a military man. You've got to understand, military men are going to do what they're told to do because that is what they are sworn to do, more or less, to defend their country. And to the best of his knowledge, he was defending the United States.
The way the government has handled this Iran Contra affair has been a travesty, and there have to be people out there who have to answer to this issue.
And I hope that the forces of democracy in Central America, namely the Contras who are fighting the Sandinistas, will prevail and defeat the totalitarian communist forces in that nation.
Under the current administration and the way things have been handled with the whole affair, it would have been impossible for everything to be uncovered, and I think that more people need to be made aware of efforts by such organizations as the Christic Institute. I think that I don't think that probably 95% of the American population is even aware of it.
Our speaker this evening, and I will introduce him at greater length shortly, is Daniel P. Sheehan, who is the Chief Counsel and Public Policy Director of the Christic Institute, located in Washington, D.C. The Christic Institute is an interfaith center for law and public policy founded in 1980. It originated out of the work that went into the investigative, legal, and public educational team which directed the eventually successful Karen Silkwood case. Since then, there have been a number of other highly successful cases that the Institute has litigated. The Institute is undertaking with this Contragate project the largest case thus far in its history. And it is involving a great number of attorneys and others all over this land. A word about the Salkan lectureship itself. It was established in memory of Samuel F. Salkan, who lived from 1895 to 1969. He was an immigrant who came to these shores at the age of 16 and eventually established a small retail firm in South Dakota, and from those quite humble beginnings established a significant and large business which today is known as Salkan and Linoff. In honor of his interest in the society, for Samuel Salkan combined a passionate interest in his Jewish legacy and in liberal religion. Samuel Salkan established a lectureship in his name, which was then continued by the foundation and continues to this day. We are very grateful to the foundation for supporting this event, as indeed it has supported the Salkan lectureships for the past 17 years. Among them have been such people as Garrett Hardin, the late Senator Frank Church, Noam Chomsky, Mary Daly, I.F. Stone, and this evening, Daniel P. Sheehan. We are privileged to have with us this evening the mayor of Minneapolis, the Honorable Donald Fraser, who will bring his greetings from the city on this occasion.
What a wonderful attendance tonight to hear Daniel Sheehan. He's back here after several years, but he's something of a TV personality nonetheless, because many of us have seen the videotape which he's made, which describes in part the experience and the knowledge which he has acquired in the connection with what he's going to talk about tonight. I was in Honduras and Nicaragua earlier this week with two other former members of Congress, Mike Barnes and Jim Shannon. I came back optimistic that there is a chance, a real chance for peace in Central America, particularly if Speaker Jim Wright will stay at the task. I think it's fair to say that whatever the conclusion is to the direct participation by the United States in backing the Contras, that the circumstances won't leave a clean, fully rationalized set of outcomes in Central America, and the question of United States policy in that area will remain an active concern for many of us. I'm not a historian, but I read a book recently, or part of a book, which described a little bit of the experience of the United States in that part of the region. I just want to read a portion of it. What it says is that what the rest of the world sees is that after we had, in the years from 1803 to 1853, rounded out the territory of continental United States by purchase and by conquest, there was a pause in our expansion, but this was followed by the purchase of Alaska in 1867, the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, the obtaining possession of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and in a different form of Cuba as a result of the Spanish War. From that time on, the expansion of American influence in the Caribbean and the West Indies has widened until there's hardly a country in that whole region which has not seen an American intervention. In an article which was printed in the New Republic, the following separate military interventions in the Caribbean were identified. In Cuba, 4, in Panama, 5, in the Dominican Republic, 5, in Nicaragua, 6, the last still in progress. Haiti, 1 still in progress. Mexico, 2, Honduras, 6, Costa Rica, 1, Colombia, 1. Scattered all over the Caribbean are American high commissioners and other officials working under treaties, loan agreements, and the like. Well, that excerpt is from a book written by Walter Lippmann in 1927. And he's describing the interventions that had taken place in the preceding 30 years. So we have been deeply involved in that part of the country, and what we're going to hear about in part tonight is some of the intrigue which has been a part of American policy. I think a tragic chapter, but nonetheless one that we're going to have to come to terms with if we're going to ever regain a decent and responsible American policy in that part of the world. So I'm delighted to be able, with you, to welcome Daniel Sheehan here to the city of Minneapolis.
The Salkan Foundation, which, as I indicated earlier, has been supporting these lectures since 1971 to the present time, neither approves nor disapproves the selection of the speaker which a committee of the society makes. Our selection this year is Daniel P. Sheehan, who is a Harvard College honors graduate in American government. He graduated from Harvard Law School in 1970 and went on to study the theological roots of the legal system, of Western culture, and of the United States in particular at Harvard Divinity School. So he combines a considerable interest not only in politics but also in ethics, let alone the law. He has practiced law very extensively, both in New York and Washington, and following his stint at Harvard Divinity, he served as general counsel at the U.S. Jesuit Headquarters Office of Social Ministry in our nation's capital. In that capacity, he subsequently served as the principal Washington, D.C. lobbyist for the national religious community in its opposition to the infamous Senate Bill 1, a notoriously draconian federal criminal code drawn up originally by Richard Nixon and John Mitchell, the President and Attorney General of the United States, respectively. A word about how we shall proceed this evening. After Daniel Sheehan has made his presentation, we will take a 3 or 4 minute break, and during that time, questions from the audience, including some from the viewer audience, will be compiled and brought to the stage. That will be for about 3 or 4 minutes. And following that, we will go into the question and answer session, and you are welcome to write down your questions during the course of this lecture. It is now my pleasure, then, to present to you the 11th Samuel F. Salkan Lecturer, Daniel P. Sheehan, General Counsel of the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C., speaking on the supremely important subject of our constitutional crisis, the untold story behind the Iran Contra affair. Mr. Sheehan.
Good evening. We gather here together this evening in the heartland of America to await the final report of the Senate and House Joint Select Committee investigating the Iran Contra scandal. It is scheduled to be released tomorrow in Washington, D.C., and we await the responsible action of our elected representatives in the face of a scandal which has torn our country in the 200th anniversary year of our Constitution. And yet we await the filing of this final report with a strange recognition of the pretense as opposed to reality, which has characterized the past several years of our national history together. We recall together back in 1980 when Ronald Reagan campaigned for the presidency of our country on the promise that he would bring to us a balanced national budget and that he would eliminate the national debt, which had been built up over a 200-year period. During the course of one presidency, he has tripled the national debt, which it took us 200 years to create. He also campaigned on the promise that he would bring stability to our economy because there was a degree of inflation at the time, and during his course in the presidency, he has authorized massive mergers and buyouts of corporate America. The stock market has soared and now crashed in the worst crash in the history of our stock market. And on the covers of Time magazine and Newsweek this week, we see the stories inside about the fact that we now are discussing how to compare our present economic state with 1929. President Reagan also campaigned on the grounds that he was going to bring peace and security to our country. And now for the first time we see our White House protected by concrete barricades surrounding all the driveways, and we have seen our Marine Corps men be sent to Beirut to be bombed in their barracks. And he is asking for now some $270 million to be given to the Contras who have not been able to win a single military encounter in Central America. And of course, we can't leave out the President's bold move to place the American flag on the Kuwaiti ships in the Persian Straits in a demonstration of our will to confront Iran after a United States naval vessel was attacked by Iraq. Now, those of us who are puzzled by this peculiar response need only to look to the fact that the President has also, as a basis for his campaigning to be our President, promised that he would bring us military security. And he has, in fact, spent some $1 trillion of our tax dollars to strengthen our military by building the B-1 bomber, which doesn't even work, and its own pilots don't want to fly, as well as the Bradley fighting machine, which will take one shot and explode and kill all of the U.S. soldiers that are in the nearby vicinity, which it is designed to protect. He's also brought us, of course, the M1 tank, which you have to take the engine out of to change the oil. And finally, of course, we have to remember that the President's wife, Nancy Reagan, had expected him to win the Nobel Peace Prize this year. But to his shock and amazement, it was given to Oscar Arias, a man to whom he disagrees completely with. Now, this strange pretense, however, should come as no big surprise to the American people, because we have to remember, after he came to office in 1981, in January, we have to all remember, I think, together, his appearing on the halftime of the 1981 Super Bowl. He was interviewed there by NBC's top political correspondent, Brent Musburger. And Brent said to him, "Well, Mr. President, you sort of broke into this business as a sportscaster, didn't you?" And the President said, "Well, yes, I did, Brent. In fact," he said, "I used to broadcast baseball games. I didn't go to the baseball games, of course," he pointed out. What he did is he sat in a room with a microphone and a ticker tape. And the ticker tape would come out, and all that it would say is that the ball was hit to player number 5, who threw it to player number 3, and the batter was out. And he said, but that seemed a little dry. So what I would do is, he said, I would make up things. And I would get this information, and I would say, well, it's a hot ground ball, it's a hard ground ball, just coming to the shortstop, he dives and just barely catches it and throws it out, and he gets him at first base just barely in time. And Brent Musburger sat there saying, "Good, Mr. President, that's very good." And the President of the United States said, of course, his favorite time was when the tape broke entirely. And there was nothing coming out. But he said, "This didn't stop me. I merely fabricated an entire baseball game." Now, if this had been Mort Saul or some other professional comedian, it might have been a lot funnier. This was the President of the United States in front of 100 million American citizens and people all around the world watching the Super Bowl. We should have begun to suspect at that time that we were in for some difficulties. If we didn't know that, we should have looked to his administration, and instead of bringing in economic experts and professional experts on public policy, he began to fill his administration with public relations men, people from Madison Avenue, people who brought us that great television commercial, "Drink coffee, it will calm you down." You've all seen that interesting commercial? These are the same men that brought us the obvious proposition that ketchup was a vegetable in our children's school lunches in the public school program, so that they could withdraw money from that program to help build the Bradley fighting machine. And of course, it's the same administration that brought us the proposition that Judge Bork was a moderate. In fact, a moderate who didn't believe that the 14th Amendment brought the constitutional protections that we have over and against the federal government in the Bill of Rights to apply against the states. Things like the First Amendment, freedom of speech and religion. Because he pointed out that, in fact, the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, and everyone knows that the Civil War was fought solely for the purpose of freeing the blacks. And therefore, it must apply only to black people. Indeed, this moderate disagreed with virtually every major United States Supreme Court decision for the past 25 years. But he did agree with a proposition that the president ought to be an aggressive advocate of his unilateral rights to act and to assert his ultimate authority as the executive of our country. Now, how does this type of pretense relate to the present constitutional crisis that we face today? Let's go back together, if we can, to that interesting day in January of 1981 when President Reagan was sworn into office at the inauguration. We'll recall that day in Washington with President Carter coming onto the stage with him, and President Carter giving his speech retiring from office, and then all of the networks cut to Tehran and watched the hostages being led out of the embassy. And then they cut back to Ronald Reagan standing, taking the oath of office from Chief Justice Warren Burger, and then all the networks cut back to Tehran, showing the hostages being driven out in cars out to the airport. And then it cut back to President Reagan's acceptance speech and becoming the President of the United States, and then cut back to Tehran, watching the 52 hostages being flown into the sky to freedom. Did anyone get the sense that that was a bit choreographed? Right at that moment, we should have begun to suspect that something was going on here. And the president, when he came to office in January of 1981, began to tell us that now that this hostage crisis was over, what we ought to turn our attention to is this little peasant government in Nicaragua. Because this was a Marxist, communist, totalitarian regime that was intending to wage war in the Western Hemisphere. They were just several days' drive south of the Harlingen district of Texas. And each time he gave the speech, they came a little closer. These communist totalitarians were just a couple days' drive from Harlingen, Texas. And he told us, however, that there was a group of men, freedom fighters, comparable to our founding fathers, known as the Contras, and that he had heard about them, yes, but he wanted to give us his assurances that he was in no way giving any direct support to this group, though he shared their objectives and wished them well. Now, the American public immediately suspected that he might not be telling the truth. The world of journalism inquired, and before too long they found out, sure enough, the President of the United States had signed a National Security Decision Directive directing Bill Casey, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, to give military equipment to the Contras, funding to the Contras, help recruit for the Contras. And when this confrontation was made by the journalist community with the President of the United States said, "Oh, you mean those Contras? Oh, well, yes, we're giving them some modicum of support, but let me give you my word that we're only giving them a minimal amount of support just to facilitate them interdicting the smuggling of military equipment and arms from the totalitarian communist regime of Nicaragua to the communist rebels inside El Salvador, who are threatening that fledgling democracy of Duarte and Roberto Dubuisson." And that is all that we're really doing, once again giving us his word of honor. Again, people began to suspect that that might not be true. The journalists began to look for the information and evidence to support that assertion. No evidence was forthcoming. And so a directive was given to the Central Intelligence Agency by the President to come up with the information to show that there were weapons being transported from Nicaragua to the rebels in El Salvador. The job was assigned to a Central Intelligence Agency analyst by the name of David McMichael. David McMichael worked day and night, but couldn't find any evidence to support the proposition. And so he inquired among the Central Intelligence Agency superiors what in the world was the evidence to support what the President was saying to everyone. And they said, well, it was very hard to get because these Sandinistas were probably smuggling these weapons across this big lake in Managua over into El Salvador during the nighttime. David McMichael said, well, how can you see them? They said, we can't, because they're doing it in the dark. And so David McMichael inquired, well, do you have some of that sophisticated radar on the water to pick up these boats in the nighttime? He said, well, yes, we do have such radar, but we can't pick them up. We think they're using wooden boats that don't show up on our radar. So David McMichael found no evidence to support the President's assertion, and so he prepared a report and filed it, saying there was no such evidence to support this proposition. The President continued to go on national television, asserting again and again that, in fact, the only reason we were giving this modicum of support to the Contras was to support their ability to interdict this massive flow of military equipment from Nicaragua to the rebels in El Salvador. Finally, despairing of any good faith response within the administration, David McMichael went and held a press conference and announced publicly that there was no evidence to support the President's assertion. The administration responded by firing David McMichael, who now is an analyst working for the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C. To this, the President responded by saying, okay, okay. Now, you got me on that one. But how about this one? We are giving military support in a limited fashion to the Contras solely for the purpose of assisting them in applying pressure to the Sandinista government to get them to live up to the ideals and the promises of their revolution. Remember that one? Do we all remember how supportive Ronald Reagan was of that revolution? Do we remember his consistent and constant support for Anastasio Somoza, the dictator of that country, who had been condemned by all of the churches, all of the synagogues, all of the human rights groups around the world, had all of the support withdrawn from him by the business community in Nicaragua because of his consistent pattern of violating the human rights of his own citizenry. And never once did Ronald Reagan suggest the slightest support for that revolution. Well, even this story didn't last long because, of course, they were caught mining the harbors in Nicaragua, destroying international shipping in violation of all of the most basic laws of international law, and passing out a manual advising the Contras to carry out terrorist political assassinations against members of the business community, banking community, mayors, town clerks inside Nicaragua, non-combatant civilians, to demonstrate that the Nicaraguan Sandinista government was incapable of protecting its own citizens. At that point, we recall the American public revolted and demanded that something be done, and the United States Congress passed in March of 1984 the Boland Amendment, prohibiting the President or any of the executive agencies of our government that were engaged in intelligence activities from giving any support, direct or indirect, to the Contras. Now that is the point in March of 1984 where the Christic Institute was first brought into this issue. We, with you, were standing watching this process going on, trying to figure out what in the world could be done to stop this activity on the part of the White House and on the part of the Contras. And we were contacted in March of 1984 by Bishop John Fitzpatrick's staff in the Harlingen district of Texas. Just one short day's drive from Nicaragua. And we were told that the first workers in the sanctuary movement had been arrested by the Justice Department and were being criminally prosecuted for unlawful transportation of undocumented Central American aliens. Sister Diane Mullenkamp, Catholic sister, a Christian lay worker by the name of Stacy Merck, and a Dallas Times Herald reporter by the name of Jack Fisher had all been arrested and were going to be prosecuted. We were asked to go in and to provide the criminal defense for these people. We traveled to the Harlingen district, and we discovered that under the Reagan administration, the Immigration and Naturalization Office in Harlingen, Texas, under a virtual state of siege from the peasant government in Nicaragua, hours south of the border, were compelled to suspend the law passed by Congress, the Immigration Act, or the Refugee Act of 1980, which had mandated as a matter of law that any person who found themselves within the United States and harbored a well-founded fear that if they returned to the country of their natural origin, they would be persecuted because of their political beliefs or membership in any given social class. And they were required as a matter of law at the INS to accept applications for political asylum from such people and to process them and to allow the people to remain in the country until that legal process had been concluded. But this was not to be the case in the Harlingen district, under siege by this peasant government. So the law had been suspended by the Reagan administration. And anyone from Guatemala or El Salvador who came in and applied for political asylum were immediately being arrested and brought to the Cordillon, a stockade for imprisoning people in Texas, and they were being compelled to sign English releases, which they were told were necessary to be signed to allow your children to remain with you in the stockade, which in fact we established in the trial were waivers of all of their rights, agreeing to be deported back to their country. And as we proceeded to move into the preliminary hearing of this case, we were trying to determine why in the world this type of aggressive action was being taken against these church people. We interviewed Brenda, the Salvadorian refugee, the young 18-year-old woman with her small child who had escaped from El Salvador, who had been a young girl at a Catholic high school who had heard the tanks of the junta rolling down the streets, had attempted to escape from her school, had escaped into a small garage, that the military had opened fire on a peaceful demonstration against the government, and therefore the Catholic nuns released all of the young students from school to go home in an emergency state. When Brenda had fled, and she saw the tanks coming down the street, and she fled into a garage where an old man had beckoned a number of people to come to safety. And they moved into the garage, several dozen people, enclosed the garage. And they heard the armored personnel carrier coming down the street and pulling up and stopping in front of the closed garage door. And these people, knowing what was about to happen, began to pass the babies and children across the top of the crowd in the garage to the back, when 50 caliber machine gun fire was opened on them through the garage, slaughtering virtually all of the people there. Brenda was buried beneath the bodies, and she remembered listening to the sound of the human blood pouring through the pile of bodies onto her in her little Catholic school uniform. And she said that she had heard the wings of the angel of death. And she devoted herself at that moment to helping the people of Central America. And so, when she was found alive, she volunteered to work for the Green Cross, a group of people providing medical assistance on a non-discriminatory basis with the church groups down in El Salvador. And she told of the military coming to the minister and telling him that he was not allowed to give any type of medical assistance to anyone that wasn't approved by the military junta. And when he refused to agree to that, he was taken away, his thumbs wired behind his back, and taken to the police headquarters and hung up by ropes by his thumbs until his shoulder blades were broken out in his shoulder. And he was kept there for several weeks being tortured to try to extract this agreement from him. And Amnesty International intervened and obtained his release. And he came back and continued to provide medical assistance to all who came. And Brenda told of the story of the military and the death squads coming, searching through the apartments, looking for her and the woman who was 7 months pregnant, who worked with her as an aide to the minister and the doctor. And seeing this woman taken from her home, stripped in the square, and her being cut open with a bayonet, and having the baby taken from her, and her being decapitated in the square. At that time, Brenda seized her baby and ran to the churches for support and help. And she came to the United States to find protection. And she swam across the Rio Grande with her baby. And she told this story. And we said that we were going to tell that story. And we began to tell the story to the jury. And how these INS men had captured her, she and her baby, and a young man who was at Casa Romero with her, where she had fled to across the border. It was kept by the Catholic Church in Brownsville. And this young man, Mauricio, had accompanied her and her baby, the baby that was not his, fleeing from Herod's men into freedom. And we put the information to the jury. And during that trial, we were approached by a Methodist minister who said that he could help explain what the attitude was on the part of the Justice Department in prosecuting these people. That he had been approached, he said, during discussions in his congregation about having a sanctuary there by a special field agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And this minister was told by this FBI agent not to be associated with the sanctuary movement or the Catholic Church because they were smuggling known communist terrorists into the United States. And that these known communist terrorists were going to be forming themselves into secret military cadres. And they were going to be attacking U.S. military installations, communication centers, and water resource centers if President Reagan found it necessary to launch a unilateral military strike with U.S. military personnel into Central America, either into Nicaragua or El Salvador. And we dismissed this information when we first heard it, but within the week we were contacted by yet a second minister from the Valley, and he told us that he too had been approached by yet a second FBI field agent and told the identical story. So at the conclusion of the preliminary hearing in that case, we returned to Washington, D.C. We began to undertake an investigation at the Christic Institute. And we learned that on the 6th of April of 1984, President Ronald Reagan had signed a classified National Security Decision Directive, number 52, directing the preparation of a secret military mobilization to test the feasibility of undertaking a secret military strike from the United States into Central America, either Nicaragua or El Salvador. The program was to be codenamed Operation Night Train. But a second part of the readiness exercise was a domestic exercise, codenamed Rex 84. Under this part of the secret exercise, they were going to test the feasibility of rounding up, within a 2-week period of time, 400,000 undocumented Central American aliens and incarcerating them in 10 military detention facilities prepared in the United States. To do this, they were going to have to temporarily suspend the Constitution of the United States. And they were going to work in coordination with the Federal Emergency Management Agency to coordinate the Defense Department and the state National Guard units, working with a mysterious group of private citizens that were to be designated as the State Defense Forces. However, we could find no such groups. We soon learned that the state of Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama had been contacted by Federal Emergency Management Agency officials and asked to pass state legislation establishing these state defense forces who would act as auxiliary police to enforce the law during the state of national emergency declared by the President during the suspension of our Constitution. However, the only people that had been notified about the availability of these volunteer positions were people who participated in the Soldier of Fortune organizations, persons who participated in the weekend war games of the survivalists training camps. Now, we continued our investigation and learned that under Rex 84, they were going to test the feasibility of distributing military equipment from the DOD to the state National Guard units to these state defense forces. And once this military equipment was distributed to these men, hypothetically some $12 million worth of military equipment, the equipment, once in their hands, was going to be revalued from its lower manufacturer cost value to its much higher replacement value of some $16 to $18 million in this hypothetical. And then at the end of this exercise, because we have to remember this was just an exercise, after this practice run, $12 million worth of military equipment was going to be gathered up at the end of the exercise and returned to the DOD. And that this would leave approximately some $4 to $6 million worth of military equipment in the hands of the state defense forces. Now, when we pursued our investigations, we were told, our investigators were told in the field, not to be so worried. This wasn't what it looked like. They were placated with the assertion by a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard that these weapons were not going to be kept by these right-wing survivalists. This military equipment was going to be smuggled to the Contras. And so what we had discovered at the Christic Institute, while engaging in protecting the people in the sanctuary movement and representing the churches and synagogues involved in this movement, we had uncovered a major arms smuggling scenario. And we learned that also in Alabama, the 20th Special Forces Unit was declaring surplus masses of amounts of military equipment. And these people were moving this military equipment down to the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport. And they were transporting it on private planes down to the Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador. And there it was being transshipped into Guatemala, being transferred over into Nicaragua and down into Costa Rica on the southern front of Nicaragua, where it was being stored at the ranch of a millionaire American rancher by the name of John Hull. We began to search for plaintiffs to have standing to complain about this type of breach of law, this violation of the Boland Amendment, this confrontation with our Constitution. But over the past years, under the Nixon administration and the Reagan administration, they have whittled away at the concept of standing to try to prevent public interest lawsuits from being brought to the courts, to avoid what they consider to be activism on the part of the courts. So it would be very difficult to find someone who was especially injured in an American citizen by this conduct. All of us were injured equally by the defiance of our laws, by the violation of our Constitution, by the threat to our constitutional liberties. But who could we find that was specially injured, peculiarly injured, uniquely injured by this activity? And it was at that time, in May of 1984, that we learned that on Memorial Day, May 30th of 1984, Eden Pastora, the former Comandante Zero of the Sandinista Revolution, who had become disenchanted with the Sandinista government and had gone to Costa Rica to establish a Southern Front Contra group, had called a press conference at a small jungle retreat just across the river from Costa Rica into Nicaragua at a place called La Penca. He had called this press conference to denounce the Contra FDN organization run by Adolfo Calero under the leadership of 14 of the top 15 military commanders of Anastasio Somoza, the former military dictator of Nicaragua. And he had called the press conference to denounce the American Central Intelligence Agency under Bill Casey and Dewey Claridge and Alan Farns, refusing to accept their domination and orders. And he called the press conference, and we can see on the videotapes, which we have of this press conference, of the reporters, the international journalist community, being brought up the river to this small jungle retreat. We see the people coming into a small wooden frame building and coming in to prepare for the press conference of Eden Pastora. Among the men we see a man, purportedly a Danish journalist by the name of Per Anker Hansen, wearing a baseball cap and t-shirt, and comes into the room on the videotape with a large aluminum camera case. And he walks to the front of the room, to the table where Eden Pastora was scheduled to speak, and he places the aluminum camera case at the foot of the table. And he sits down, and as Eden Pastora enters, and the rest of the international journalist community are seen surging forward to participate in the press conference, you see Per Anker Hansen skulking from the room on the videotape, and down the side of the room and out the back door. And then an associate of Eden Pastora, as he begins to speak, comes to bring him a cup of coffee, and she accidentally kicks over the aluminum camera case, and it falls on its side. And as Eden Pastora goes on, a couple minutes later, a blinding explosion erupts and slaughters 8 of the people in the room, 3 of whom are international journalists, one of them an American by the name of Linda Frazier. And it maims 24 of the other people in the international press conference, tearing legs and arms, blowing portions of their skull away and blinding them and deafening them. And the lenses on the camera are blown out from the flash of the explosion, but you can still hear the death all around on the videotapes, which are available for you to see this terrible tragedy occur. You can hear the death all around. And the bulletins went out across Central America announcing that this had happened. One of the people who was severely injured in that bombing explosion was Tony Avergon, the ABC television cameraman sent there to film the press conference. He, with the other survivors, was taken out while the broadcasts were going out across Central America. His wife, Martha Honey, was at home that night with their 2 children, preparing her final story for the New York Times. She was a stringer for the New York Times in her own right, and a reporter for the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. And she heard the bulletins, and she and her children went to the hospital, searching among the dead and the dying and the maimed for her husband, to find him arriving only at the very end with the last ambulance, with a huge hole torn in his side, his hands and arms burnt, and his face and chest filled with shrapnel. And she stood by his side during the night to see whether he would live, and he was one of the lucky ones who did. He was taken to the United States by ABC for plastic surgery and emergency surgery, and after months was eventually well enough to leave the hospital. He and Martha Honey went to the American Newspaper Guild and asked that they establish a grant and a fund to investigate, to find out who had done this horrible deed to the international journalist community. The American Newspaper Guild responded, the Committee to Protect Journalists responded, and established a fund to supervise this investigation. Within the year that they investigated, they were deluged with reports from the United States Embassy that this was the Sandinista who had done this to eliminate Pastora, that they were told that it was an ETA terrorist from Spain who'd been hired by the Sandinista to do this. All of these things proved to be false because within the year, a man by the name of Carlos Rojas Chinchilla, a young restaurant owner in San Jose, was sitting in a bar March 29, 1985, on the way home from work, when three men entered the bar across the street from the United States Embassy. And one of the men stayed and the other two left. The man who stayed, sitting in the bar with only Carlos and a couple other people in the bar, turned to Carlos and asked for his help. You've got to help me. You've got to help me get away from these people. These people are right now going across the street to case out the United States Embassy. They're going to be bombing the United States Embassy in the near future. We are the same people who blew up the Lepenka press conference. These men are right-wing terrorists. I've got to get away. They're supplying their materials by selling cocaine. They all are based on the ranch nearby of a millionaire American rancher by the name of John Hull. And Martha and Tony pursued their investigation, had Carlos follow up and interview David and get names and dates and details of the planning in this terrorist group. And they filed a report in Costa Rica. And John Hull, who'd been there for over 20 years and owned or managed over 8,000 acres of land up on the border of Costa Rica and Nicaragua, a close associate of the United States Embassy staff, filed a criminal charge of libel against them. And they contacted the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C., and asked that we assist in defending them, to bring the information that we had about John Hull in the criminal smuggling system. And we went down and worked with them, presenting this evidence through Otto Castro, a local lawyer, who stood before them and demanded that the judicial system of Costa Rica and the people of Costa Rica take a stand against these people, to defy the Contras, to not allow them to use their territory, and to bring them to justice. And the court responded by declaring that Martha and Tony were completely vindicated, that we had demonstrated through 10 witnesses the veracity of the charges they had filed, and dismissed all of the charges against them. And John Hull skulked out of the court, growling, "This isn't over yet." And little did he know how right he was. Because Martha Honey and Tony Avergon and the Christic Institute had joined forces to decide to bring a major federal lawsuit against these men in Miami, where we had learned that the C4 explosives and equipment were being shipped through to his ranch. But as we were preparing that, we found more and more evidence demonstrating that these aircraft that were flying the equipment down through the radar and landing on John Hull's ranch were unloading the weapons and being filled with 17-pound duffel bags of cocaine and brought back up through the same pipe system into the United States, being offloaded and sold, and a portion of the profits being used to purchase more weapons and more explosives. Why? Because the United States Congress would not support this military operation. We, the American people, would not support this military operation. And so they had established a partnership with the dreaded Medellin cartel of cocaine traffickers in Colombia. Jorge Ochoa, Pablo Escobar, who were partners with Carlos Lerner and Carlos Quintero Cruz, the man who tortured the DEA agent in Mexico and killed him. Carlos Lerner, the self-confessed Nazi, is now under arrest down in Miami. That these men had sent $10 million to the Contras through a man by the name of Felix Rodriguez, delivered through another man by the name of Ramon Milian Rodriguez, who has now testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee behind closed doors as to this fact. And therefore, we discovered that there was much more going on here than just a simple arms sale, that this was, for all intents and purposes, a federal racketeering enterprise engaged in all the violations of the predicate acts of the Racketeering Act: murder, arson, kidnapping, because it was later learned that David, who had been the man who came to Carlos, had been kidnapped and taken to John Hull's ranch and tortured to death to obtain information as to who he was sharing the information with. And Carlos was later kidnapped, but escaped and fled with the assistance of Martha and Tony to Norway, where he was kept in safety and is now under the protection of Amnesty International. It is not just John Hull and Tom Posey and these people. The people behind this operation are a man by the name of Theodore Shackley, a man by the name of Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, Tom Kleins, Rafael Chichi Quintero. These men own and operate something they call the Enterprise. It is an off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing, covert operations capacity, operating out from under the control of the President of the United States, out from under the control of the Director of Central Intelligence, out from under any supervision or oversight of any congressional committee, and without the knowledge of the American people. This operation has been working for many, many years. Their support for the Contras is just the latest in a long series of ventures of this enterprise. And he began to share the information which we want to share briefly with you as to what the facts are that we are faced with. That we are going to be told tomorrow by the United States Congress that this is simply an ad hoc, temporary coalition of men brought together by an ambitious but misguided lieutenant colonel Oliver North, who gathered these people together in October of 1984 after the passage of the Boland Amendment to assist in funding and supporting the Contras in the single operation against the government of Nicaragua. And it will be acknowledged that they were overzealous, and it will be acknowledged that the president perhaps exercised poor managerial style, but that all is solved now because these people have been found out, and after all, the president never knew. Because John Poindexter told us that he hadn't told the president. Now that was very naughty of John Poindexter. And that was unfortunately excessive on the part of Lieutenant Colonel North. And so we should make sure to state strongly as the United States Congress that this not be done again. And that is the image that they attempt to convey to the American public. But in fact, what is true is that these men, Theodore Shackley, Tom Kleins, Albert Hakim, Rafael Chichiquintero, their other associates in the operation, Felix Rodriguez, Ramon Medina, and the other men, John Singlaub, Ronald Joseph Martin, others, whom you have heard about now many times in testimony, that these are the men who have been running this private enterprise. And these men go back some time now. In fact, they go back to January of 1959, when the peasant government of Fidel Castro came to power, ousting Batista, when a meeting was held in Washington, D.C. on the 1st of January, 1959, chaired by the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon, the head of a secret group inside the National Security Council called the 5412 Committee. They resolved that they were going to recruit those people who fled, the supporters of the right-wing dictator, Batista, who fled into Miami and Tampa. And they were going to organize them into a secret, covert, low-intensity combat operation to be codenamed Operation 40. And they would mount low-intensity combat assaults into Cuba, burning sugar fields, blowing up transportation facilities, destroying storage facilities, and poisoning exports to demonstrate that this peasant government could not function effectively without the supervision of the United States and some dictator following the directives of the U.S. But that was not adequate to their means, their objectives. And so in the middle of 1960, Richard Nixon decided that he wanted to supplement Operation 40. And he reached out to Howard Hughes, a man with whom he had a very special relationship. And Howard Hughes provided a man for Richard Nixon to attend a meeting on Richard Nixon's behalf with representatives of Santo Trafficante, the Don of the Mafia in Tampa, who used to be the Don of the Mafia in Havana, running the gambling casinos, the prostitution, and the narcotics. This meeting was attended by, on behalf of Richard Nixon, by a man by the name of Robert Mayhew, the chief of staff of Howard Hughes. Santo Trafficante sent Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana. Now, this meeting, and I'll be brief about this because many of you have heard some of this information before, but this meeting set up a secret political assassination team codenamed the S-Force, or Shooter Team. And the men who were on that group, recruited up out of the ranks of Operation 40, are extremely important for you to know. Because one of the men recruited for the assassination team in the middle of 1960 by Richard Nixon in Santo Trafficante was a man by the name of Felix Rodriguez, the man named by Eugene Hasenfuss as the commander of the airlift for the Contra's resupply out of Ilopango. Another man on the assassination team, organized in the middle of 1960, was Ramon Medina, whose real name is Jose Posada Correa, who was the number 2 man running the Ilopango air supply for the Contras. 3 other men on that team were Rolando Martinez, a man by the name of Diaz, and Frank Sturgis. Now, these people may be a bit more familiar to you, not because you know that they were political assassins that were on the shooter team, but because these are 3 of the men who were caught in the Watergate Hotel in 1972, burglarizing the office of Larry O'Brien, who was the head of the Democratic National Committee, but who immediately prior to that time had been the number 2 man in the Howard Hughes empire under Robert Mayhew. Now, this is a key team. Rafael Chichi Quintero was on that team. Raul and Rafael Villaverde, Ricardo Chavez, a number of other men on this secret assassination team. These men moved together throughout the world under the supervision later of the Miami station chief for the CIA, a man by the name of Theodore Shackley. His assistant in charge of training was Tom Kleins. These men have moved together across the world, from running the low-intensity combat operation against Cuba, into Laos, where they ran the assassination training program of the Mayo tribe, financed in part by the heroin income of Vang Pao, into running the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which assassinated some 60,000 non-combatant civilians, and were later transferred together again, Tom Kleins and Theodore Shackley, to run Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA in 1971, where they ran Track 2 against Salvador Allende, where in fact Tom Kleins and Rafael Chichi Quintero and Shackley helped supervise the team that kidnapped and assassinated General Schneider, the chief of staff for Allende, and then ran the operation assassinating Allende and overthrowing his democratically elected socialist government. They then were moved to be the directors of Far East operations for the CIA. And this is a critical point, because between 1971 and 1975, this period we're now focusing on, was a period of great upsurge in our country. Because in 1971, we had learned about the existence of the Phoenix program. The United States Congress investigated that and ordered it stopped. In 1972, the Watergate burglary, the investigations of Watergate and the Watergate hearings, the discovery in Senator Frank Church's subcommittee of the Special Select Committee on Intelligence Abuses, discovered the counterintelligence program of the FBI, infiltrating American citizens groups, feminist groups, black nationalist groups, anti-war groups, labor groups. They also discovered the Central Intelligence Agency functioning here in the United States through Operation Chaos in Operation Shamrock. And there was a great upsurge of reform demanding that these, what are known as black operations, be stopped, that they were criminal operations in violation of our Constitution, in violation of the most basic tenets of our Judeo-Christian ethical system prohibiting assassination in torture and terror. And so, in preparation for the potential selection of a reform administration in 1976, after all of these revelations, these men began during this period of time setting up an off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, standalone covert operations capacity that did not need to be run by the President or the Director of Central Intelligence or be known to the Congress or to the people. And they began to take military equipment out of the field in Vietnam and steal thousands of tons of military equipment from the fighting forces and move them to Thailand, to the Udorn Air Base, under the supervision of Daniel C. Arnold in Thailand. They began to embezzle millions and millions of dollars out of the Southeast Asian drug funds that were being used prior to that time to finance part of the covert operations in the secret war in Laos and Cambodia and Thailand. They embezzled this money and they brought it down to the Nugan Hand Bank down in Australia, and they set up secret black funds. This operation also was supplemented after the war in Vietnam, starting in 1976, by Richard Secord, who in fact was made the director of foreign military sales in the Middle East. And he began to do an interesting thing. He was responsible for selling military equipment to Middle Eastern countries. So what he would do is he would obtain the military equipment at the manufacturer cost and would sell it to them at the much higher replacement value. And then he would skim off the additional profit, return the manufacturer cost to the Pentagon, and take the extra money and put it in the Nugan Bank into the secret accounts of the enterprise for future covert operations. And this is the group that was operating in the Middle East when President Carter was elected in 1976. Between 1976 and 1980, President Carter and his Director of Central Intelligence, Stansfield Turner, transferred or terminated from the Covert Operations section of the CIA 820 men. Men who had been guilty of criminal racketeering activities, assassination, terrorism, partnership with narcotics traffickers, and they merely moved them out. And that is where these people came from. They were under the supervision, some of them, of Theodore Shackley, who was the director by 1976 of all covert operations worldwide for the Central Intelligence Agency, operating under George Bush, who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency at that time. But these men were not prosecuted along with Edwin P. Wilson, who was their business partner, because these men had, while still in government before they were terminated, they set up a private corporation in Egypt named the Egyptian American Transport and Service Company. Edwin Wilson was a partner in that with Theodore Shackley and Richard Secord and Eric von Marbod and Tom Klein. And this operation embezzled over $8 million from the Foreign Military Sales Program under the Camp David Accords. And they were caught doing so. And they were criminally indicted for doing so. And they were required to pay back $2.5 million and to pay a fine of $100,000. But these men were not criminally prosecuted because the investigation of Edwin Wilson, undertaken by Larry Barcella, the Assistant U.S. Attorney in Virginia, began to pursue Theodore Shackley and Tom Klein in the Egyptian American Transport and Service Company. But he was approached by Michael Ledeen and told to stand down from this investigation because this might be a special secret covert operation. And when Barcella did not stand down, he was visited by a man by the name of Mark Richard and another man by the name of Ted Greenberg. And these men told Barcella to stop his investigation. He didn't, and so he was replaced. And a decision was made at that time to allow Theodore Shackley and Tom Klein to resign and go quietly into that good night. That decision was made to not allow them to be criminally prosecuted by the Deputy Director for Operations of the Central Intelligence Agency, Frank Carlucci. And when it was discovered in 1982 that Richard Secord also had been a partner of EATSCO, and he was ordered to stand down from his command as the director of DSAA, the Defense Security Assistance Administration in the Middle East, in preparation for taking lie detector tests, all of a sudden, he was ordered reinstated and allowed to retire. This decision was made by the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Frank Carlucci, who had moved from the Central Intelligence Agency to the Defense Department and allowed him to leave as well. And when, in fact, Frank Carlucci left the government, he went to work for Sears World Trade, selling weapons with a business partner by the name of Eric von Marbod, who was the business partner in EATSCO with Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, Tom Klein, and Richard Secord. This is the operation which in 1977, when the United States government cut off Anastasio Somoza from all military support because of his consistent violation of the human rights of his own citizenry. These are the men who sent Rafael Chichi-Quintero and Edwin Wilson, their agents, to meet with Anastasio Somoza and to enter into a contract to provide him assassination personnel to attack the Sandinista leadership, and later in February of 1979 to offer him weapons, to sell him weapons, because they had the end-user certificates, they knew where the weapons were, they had thousands of tons of military equipment secretly stored at Udorn Air Base in Thailand, they had the money in the Nugan Bank, and they were a self-sustaining, standalone operation, acting in total and utter defiance of the United States government. And these are the men that sustained Anastasio Somoza in power from October of 1977 to July 19th of 1979, when he collapsed. And he fled, eventually locating himself at Norman Cay, an island in the Bahamas owned by Robert Vesco. There he met with Rafael Chichi-Quintero on behalf of the enterprise, and they, meeting with his military commanders, his National Guard commanders, agreed to continue to supply the military equipment and the money for recruiting and what they needed to form the Contras. And thus, these Contras began to wage their war against the new peasant government of the Sandinista in Nicaragua, forcing them into some unwise decisions to restrict journalism and freedom of the press and other bad judgments that they made under attack from the Contras. And so, when President Reagan came to office in January of 1981, he did not create the Contras. Bill Casey did not create the Contras. Oliver North did not create the Contras. It was the secret team, the enterprise, that created the Contras. And they simply took the Contra ball and turned it over to the Reagan administration. And the Reagan administration signed the National Security Decision Directive directing Bill Casey and Vincent Canestraro and the others to provide the military equipment, funding, and everything, which went on all the way to 1984, when they were caught mining the harbors in Nicaragua, and we were sued in the World Court, and Ronald Reagan withdrew the United States from the World Court. And when Congress passed the Boland Amendment prohibiting the Reagan administration or any other agency of the executive branch that engaged in intelligence activity from giving any support, direct or indirect, to the Contras, the Reagan administration simply took the Contra ball and passed it back to the secret team. But they left in place a liaison. Indeed, the deputy director of the National Security Council in charge of political military liaison, a young, ambitious lieutenant colonel by the name of Oliver North. And that is what Oliver North is. Oliver North did not create this group. He did not create the secret team. He did not create the Contras. Nor did John Poindexter, nor did Bill Casey. This is the secret team in full operation. And yet, no one wants to deal with these people because they're very dangerous men. Because during this period, they have run a secret operation which is codenamed the Fish Farm, which is a highly skilled political assassination unit. And they went around the world carrying out political assassinations run by Theodore Shackley and Tom Klein. The trigger man in the operation was Rafael Chichi-Quintero, who was based secretly in the security division of Pemex, the Mexican National Oil Company, along with Ricardo Chavez, who were two of the main shooters with John Dexter. And the president of Pemex at that time, under which that operation was hidden, was a man by the name of Jorge Diaz Serrano, the former business partner of George Bush in Zapata Oil Company in Houston, Texas. But before they carried out their political assassinations against people in the Middle East, against Nicaraguans, against El Salvadorians, and against people going to the Philippines, one man had to approve, to sign off on these assassinations. That man's name was William Buckley, who was not only the Beirut station chief with the CIA, but was in fact the head of a secret anti-terrorist unit inside the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the man who in March of 1984 was kidnapped by the Shiites in Beirut, taken through the Bekaa Valley and tortured, and then taken to Iran, to the town of Qum, the birthplace of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and tortured on videotape until he revealed the existence of the off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing enterprise. And this is the information that he revealed under torture. And that is why the first contact from the Iranians demanding missiles, TOW missiles and Hawk missiles, came from Ghubbanifar, not to our Secretary of State, not to our President, not to the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but instead to Theodore Shackley, the man who ran the fish farm assassination program, hidden behind the corporate cover of a company in Jupiter, Florida, by the name of Continental Shelf Associates, a subsidiary group of which is ANV Incorporated, which stands for Acta Non Verba, action, not words. And this is the base of the assassination team, who operate without any supervision from the lawful structures or constitutional structures of our government. And these are the people that we named in May of 1986. And we described them in an 85-page affidavit filed with the court, detailing who they were, where they'd come from, what operations they'd engaged in, and described the off-the-shelf operation. And we sued them on behalf of Tony Avergan and also on behalf of Martha Honey, who was later threatened with death threats slipped under her door in the home with her children if she didn't stop her investigation. And we sued them, and we then began to try to contact people in the Congress to explain to them what was going on here. When we sued them, Adolfo Calero, one of the defendants, hired as his lawyer the former chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency, Anthony Lapham. The biggest gun runner, Ronald Joseph Martin, hired Ted Klein, the former United States attorney from Miami. And these men stood before Judge King and said, "Judge King, this is preposterous. This is a total fantasy, this lawsuit. If a massive military supply of this nature were going on down into Central America from the United States, the Justice Department would have to know about it. And if an operation like this narcotic smuggling was going on, coming into the United States through these people, our Drug Enforcement Administration would have to know about it, as would the Special Task Force on Narcotics, chaired by Vice President George Bush. Therefore implying that it wasn't true, as opposed to what we all know now. And the judge raised his eyebrow and listened to these stalwart representatives of the established government, now in private practice, and began to peruse their motion to dismiss our case, until October 6th of 1986, when Eugene Hasenfuss was shot down in his C-123 over Nicaragua, and while parachuting to safety, gave a press conference still in the air, describing every event in his entire life that he could remember, and explained that he and the other pilots were operating in this private network, and that they operated out of a safe house over in El Salvador, which he dutifully gave the address of. And so United Press International went and got the phone records of this particular safe house, and there was a list of our defendants. And the phone number of the office of Oliver North and Rob Owen, all of whom we had named in detail in the affidavit. And so the judge began to suspect that we might be on to something. And then we remember on November 25th of 1986, Attorney General Edwin Meese coming before the American public and declaring that he was startled to discover that there seemed to be some sort of private enterprise operating here that seems to have sold some tow missiles to Iran, that it was possible that a portion of the profits from that sale had been diverted to the Contras in possible violation of the Boland Amendment. And we'll remember the President of the United States getting on television and saying that he knew nothing of this and that nobody inside the government had anything to do with this. And anyway, the number of tow missiles that were involved were just minuscule. Could have been carried in one small truck. Had no chance of interfering with the balance of power between the Iranians and the Iraqis in the war. We later discovered that it was 40 tractor trailer loads full of tow missiles that went down to those people. But what we didn't know was that the reason for the negotiation and the giving of the tow missiles was not to open up some channel of communication to more moderate elements in Iran. It was not even for the more general purpose of negotiating for our hostages in general. It was instead to buy the silence of the Iranian government in its knowledge of the fish farm and the off-the-shelf, stand-alone operation run by Theodore Shackley and his secret team. And that is the price that we have paid already for these operations. Yet the price that we have paid is much greater indeed, because the secret team continues to operate. And we await the report of the special prosecutor. But wait, who drafted the charter for the special prosecutor? Edwin Meese drafted the charter for the special prosecutor, asking that the special prosecutor be confined in his investigation simply to the narrow question of determining whether a portion of the profits from the sale of the tow missiles was diverted to the Contras, and whether or not that constituted a violation of the Boland Amendment. And only a minor addition to that has been made at the request of the House Judiciary Committee filed with the Court of Appeals in Washington. And then the Congress, whom we had gone to repeatedly asking them to set up a select committee to look into this, to investigate this through the Judiciary Committee, through the Intelligence Committee, who had refused consistently to do so, determined that the White House was beginning to take away the initiative on this matter, and the Congress decided that they should set up a select committee themselves to investigate the same narrow question. Don't you find it puzzling how relieved they were when they answered the one single question of whether or not the President of the United States had known about the diversion of a part of the profits of the sale of tow missiles to Iran to be diverted to the Contras? Didn't you notice that audible sigh of relief that went up from the committee when John Poindexter said that he didn't tell the President? When John Poindexter, we'll all remember together, said, well, I knew perfectly well that the President would have agreed, because the President knew perfectly well about the raising of the $34 million and the money from the Saudi Arabians. In fact, the President said to me when the Boland Amendment was passed, John Poindexter testified, I don't like this. Can't we figure out some way to do this unilaterally? And let's do it. And he knew all about the activities of Oliver North, and John Poindexter, and Bill Casey. And yet, everyone insisted upon going back to this one single bizarre question. Did the President know about and approve the transfer or diversion of a part of the profits from the sale of tow missiles to the Contras? And John Poindexter said, no, I didn't tell him that, because I knew he'd agree anyhow, and this way he could deny it. Well, the next day, Marlon Fitzwater, the spokesman for the president, issued a statement on behalf of the president saying that it wasn't true. That in fact, if John Poindexter had asked him, he would have disagreed with him. So the next day, the distinguished senator from Georgia, Sam Nunn, asked the question of John Poindexter. He said, Mr. Poindexter, you said that if you had told the president, he would have agreed. And the president said that he wouldn't have. And John Poindexter said, in front of 40 million people on national television, see, there it is. That's the way we planned it. And while 73% of the American public polled consistently said, we don't believe either one of them, the select committee went, oh, good. We have avoided another failed presidency, is how they phrased it in Washington. And they all began to fold up their tent and go home. Why was that? Because of the 26 men appointed to the select committee to investigate, 2/3 of those men had all voted for full military funding of the Contras. Isn't that a peculiar group to put together to investigate the defiance of Congress's order that they not be funded at all? And the Democrats decided that they didn't want to look like a hanging jury to the president, so they selected to represent them such stalwarts of the Constitution as David Boren from Oklahoma and the others that you saw. So that David Boren would represent us protecting the Constitution by starting his questioning of Rob Owen by saying, Mr. Owen, I want to make clear that I agree with you and that I too supported funding the Contras, but I'd like to ask you a penetrating and perhaps embarrassing question. Do you happen to have a poem you'd like to read to Oliver North? Can you get that out for us, Mr. Owen? Devastating, withering cross-examination that you all witnessed of these committees, the members falling all over one another, trying to demonstrate how supportive they were of the Contras, and the only thing that they were worried about is whether General Secord overcharged the Contras. And that if he did, he was a chiseling little privateer who took the money out of the grasping hands of the freedom fighters and bought a Porsche. And what of Oliver North? This man who engaged in such heinous activity, the committee pointed out, is accepting the gift of a security fence around his home and used some of these millions of dollars in cash in his safe to buy snow tires. This was the gravamen of the complaint that was being filed against these people by these committee members. And given the moderate nature of the Democratic appointments, the Democratic Party could have realistically expected the Republicans to respond by also appointing moderate members for themselves. Correct? Orrin Hatch. Right? DeWine from Ohio. And also Henry Hyde from Illinois. These rational men standing for the principles of our Constitution. So what you saw was a totally warped representation from the Congress, not asking the right questions, intentionally refusing to ask the right questions. And I can tell you why. Because I testified in October after the downing of the Hassan-Flus airplane to the House Subcommittee of Western Hemisphere Affairs of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And right there sat Henry Hyde, along with Mike Barnes and DeWine and a number of others. And I told them in detail what these men had been doing and the responsibility that they would bear if they gave another dime to these men and to the Contras. And Henry Hyde stood up and demanded that all of the press be excluded from the room and that the C-SPAN cameras be turned off because, in fact, he thought national security information was being revealed here. And when we obtained a quorum of the Democrats to come back into the room in order that the hearings be reopened, this man, Henry Hyde, stood up and said, "Gentlemen, I want to warn you, you better be careful of what you have Mr. Sheehan put on the public record here, because he is charging that these men are engaged in a criminal conspiracy. And if we later this month decide to vote for $100 million in military aid to the Contras, we technically could be considered part of a criminal conspiracy to violate the Federal Neutrality Act. And so please, let's not talk about this. And so therefore, we saw this select committee go into action, the special prosecutor go pouring in on this little question that he had to answer, and we saw the president appoint the Tower Commission, headed up by Senator John Tower, President Reagan's campaign chairman in Texas, an independent man. In John Tower's report, everyone said it was amazing that they said as much as they did. But their primary criticism was that the president may well have acted with a certain inadequacy of his management style. It was unfortunately combined with the excessive zeal of a couple individuals, John Poindexter and Oliver North, on the National Security Committee. And this was now remedied by both of these men leaving. I remember that was released Thursday morning, and on the following Sunday morning, John Tower appeared on NBC Meet the Press. And John Tower pointed out that he thought that the Tower Commission had discovered that the ship of state of our country had run aground. And he pointed out that, of course, whenever a ship runs aground, ultimately the captain of the ship has to be held responsible. And so therefore, John Tower thought that Donald Reagan should resign. And so he did. And now, these men, collectively, are trying to tell us that the problem that we face here in the 200th anniversary year of our Constitution is nothing more serious than a small cancerous nodule on the nose of a single president and his administration. Whereas, in fact, the facts show that this is a cancer deep in the chest of our American body politic, and that it will not be solved by wishing that it weren't there. It will not be solved any more than the cancer in the head of our family can be ignored and pretended that it doesn't exist. And yet, the human family, we have this peculiar quality of wishing things weren't as they are sometimes, and that if we can just not talk to our father or our mother who has this cancer, that we can all pretend that it will go away. But it will not, because the seriousness of this can be demonstrated, I think, by the following. You'll recall the people who were on the assassination team. Rafael Chichi Quintero, Felix Rodriguez, Jose Posada Carrillo. Rafael Chichi Quintero is the man who delivered the $2 million from Ross Perot to try to ransom out William Buckley. He is the man who was responsible for constructing the dirt airstrip down in Costa Rica that resulted in the resignation of the United States ambassador to Costa Rica, Louis Tanz. These men are still with us. And who are these men? Remember the meeting. Robert Mayhew, Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana. You remember that meeting? These men on the shooter team were secretly moved from Florida to Fort Huachuca in Arizona and were trained down at a secret base in Oaxaca, Mexico, known as the Triangular Fire Team Base, where they were trained. And during the Watergate investigation, when it was discovered that 3 of the men that were in the Watergate Hotel, Rolando Martinez and Diaz and Frank Sturgis, had been on that special shooter team, Richard Nixon, on the tapes, has a discussion with Bob Haldeman and John Dean. And he says, John, I want you to go to the Central Intelligence Agency and tell them to go to the FBI and tell the FBI to get out of this investigation. John Dean says to him, Well, Mr. President, what am I going to say to them? Richard Nixon said, tell the Central Intelligence Agency to tell the FBI that if they don't get out of this investigation, all the Mexican stuff is going to come out. During his public testimony, Bob Haldeman was asked, during the Watergate investigation before approximately 40 million American citizens, he said, he was asked, Mr. Haldeman, what did that exchange mean? What was this Mexican stuff? And Bob Haldeman said, oh, they were talking about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. What a peculiar response. Except that when the Special Select Committee on Assassinations was appointed by the Congress to look into the President Kennedy assassination, Bob Kennedy assassination, and the assassination of Martin Luther King, Richard Sprague, former United States attorney from Philadelphia, who was the general counsel for that, issued a subpoena to Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli soon thereafter turned up dead, shot through the head several times, and in a barrel wrapped in chain in Biscayne Bay. And so Richard Sprague decided that he'd better issue some protection to the next man that he wanted to subpoena, and he sent FBI agents, before issuing the subpoena, to protect Sam Giancana. And on the Wednesday morning, before the following Monday, when Sam Giancana was to testify, with 3 FBI agents in his home in Chicago, one of the FBI agents went out to get a pack of Camels, one of them went to the bathroom, and the third went into the other room to get some fruit for the morning cereal. And Sam Giancana was assassinated at his breakfast table. At which point, Richard Sprague was fired as the general counsel for the Select Committee on Assassinations, replaced by G. Robert Blakey. His assistant was a man by the name of Richard Billings. These men said, okay, no more investigation of this. Let's just gather the information together here that we have and make a final report. The final report states, which is a matter of public record, that there is ample circumstantial evidence to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was not acting alone when he assassinated President John Kennedy, was part of a larger conspiracy group, and that those who participated in this larger conspiracy group were certain elements of organized crime and Cubans. Richard Billings came to my office several weeks ago and told me that what wasn't said in the report is that those elements of organized crime that are suspected and were concluded by them to have done it was Santo Trafficante. And the Cubans were members of the shooter team, the triangular fire team base trained in Oaxaca, Mexico. And so, all of us remember 1963. We all remember the day that the music died in our country, and how strange things have been since that time. How we find ourselves hated around the world. How we find ourselves facing endless enemies wherever we go. That we're no longer proud to be Americans traveling abroad. We live in fear, as being the objects of fear itself. And why is that? Because of the activities of the secret team, who have sown hatred and fear for our country around the world. The men who have operated in the shadows, the midnight soldiers of the national security state, who are the product of the passage of a National Security Act of 1947, setting up the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council, who began to try to gather intelligence against the activities of the KGB, but soon, following their own bureaucratic imperative, began to take unto themselves new powers that were never authorized. In fact, Clark Clifford, who drafted the National Security Act of 1947, has stated publicly that there was never the slightest intention to give the CIA or any other intelligence agency the authorization to engage in covert action. This is no radical. He has told us what the intent of that statute was. And yet these men, initially starting with gathering intelligence on the KGB, began to move in the world of espionage to counteract specific activities of the KGB. And then they moved out to oppose any kind of organizing of communist parties around the world. And then they began to organize to stop any socialist parties around the world. And eventually they came to see themselves as the midnight soldiers to defend any ally of the United States, no matter how vile, no matter how dictatorial, no matter how contrary to the democratic principles of our country, in the face of any organized effort inside the countries of those dictators to rise up and to cast them off. And so they began to infiltrate these people, carry out political assassinations, and to destroy people's movements around the world that were no more communist than our local Democratic or Republican Party. And this is what we see occurring now. And now we stand on the brink not only of awaiting a totally inadequate report from our United States Congress, but we stand on the brink of electing a new Congress and a new president in the coming year, in 1988. And for the first time, a majority of the eligible voters in the 1988 election are people who in 1963 were not even old enough to vote. You have people now moving into the possession of majority power in our country who are not responsible for the conduct of this special secret team, but who have the obligation to join with you as the new baby boom vote to see to it that these men are put out of business forever. But it's important that we all participate in this, because if the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, can engage in a glasnost and acknowledge the sins of their past and the criminal activities of Stalin and the other men in their past, and to seek a peaceful world, we can too, for we are the beacon of democracy on this planet. We still are. There is still hope for our experiment here, because the American people sincerely believe. But we do not believe that these men represent us, and we will demand political leadership that does not cower in the face of this secret team, who does not live in fear of the fact that they will be targeted by the secret team, and that black funds will be brought in through covert means into the United States and put into political action committees and target these individuals for removal from office, which is exactly what they fear. The American people are more courageous than that, that we will not abide these men who, when challenged earlier in the 1950s, filed a secret report known as the Hoover Report, saying that they had to get the American people used to methods and means that were totally unacceptable to us given our moral standards, because it was necessary for them to subvert and to destroy the enemies of their group more effectively and more viciously than the other side, and that they saw it as an important responsibility of them to convert us to that way of looking at the world, to believe that the world is a dangerous place for us, that we are besieged by terrorists and need to compromise our constitutional values for our own protection. The fact of the matter is that last year, more Americans were killed by dog bites than by terrorists. And yet these men strike such fear into us that we are going around, the American citizens, buying pit bulldogs to protect our families. And now the number of people who are dying each year in our country by dog bites is going up and up. And the fact of the matter is, we have been frightened into buying the pit bulldogs to protect us and our family, and now they are eating our children. And this thing is true of the secret team. These are the pit bulldogs of the national security state. And they, too, will eat us and our children if they are not put out. And it takes courage to do this. It takes more courage than the present representation that we have in the United States Congress and in the presidency. It takes more courage than those of us gathered here tonight have shown heretofore. And yet we have time to rise to the occasion, to show that we too can acknowledge the past sins of our leaders and can face them, and once again move to have the proud position that we deserve in this world, because democracy is a valuable thing. The right to speak and print and talk and debate as we choose is a valuable thing. The freedom to exercise our religion and the other values, our rights of privacy and rights to organize, are a valuable thing, and people around the world wish to have the advantage of these values. But these values are not to be foisted upon them with terror and suppression and military dictatorships. These are to be displayed to the world by our citizenry. And that is why here in our 200th anniversary year, to celebrate our Constitution, what we have to do is very simple. We have to write a very special letter to our congressional representatives and our senators. And we have to say that I personally am demanding that you introduce a resolution into the House and to the Senate calling for a full-scale investigation by the Judiciary Committee of all of the activities of this secret team and all of the charges that are set forth in this case. And if you don't do that, I personally am going to see to it that you are removed from office. And we are going to replace you with someone else. Because someone else can vote on behalf of all the good things you vote for in the same way you do. But if you won't deal with this here in our anniversary year of our Constitution, then you do not represent us. You do not represent the standards that we insist be met by our legislature. And we will do the hard work to see to it that you are removed. Because this secret team has to be put out of business. These men have to be sought out and convicted in a fair and decent trial. And all of those responsible for their conduct and for the failure to stop them need to be turned out of office. That we will not say yes to these men. We will not say yes to the perversion of our moral standards to accommodate them. We will not say yes to these men, and I ask you to join with me to just say no. Just say no. Thank you very much.
One is so overwhelmed that one is almost tempted to be trite. What a tangled web we weave. We thank Dan Sheehan, morally eloquent and incredibly detailed story, which, as he indicated, still goes on, and which he has suggested to you and me that we can do something about if we choose, and not get too tired in the effort. We will now go into a 3 or 4 minute break, during which time the questions that some of you may have written down on your cards and others that we hope to receive by phone from the viewer audience will be compiled and eventually brought to the stage. And at that time we will enter the last phase of this meeting, lasting about a half hour to 45 minutes, dealing with your questions and the answers that Dan Sheehan will provide you.
Well, I'd just like to say that I think that Oliver North is a very good soldier, and I think he's a good American.
I think it's very important that Sheehan is doing this, and I hope that they pursue it, because it is really a very serious constitutional aberration and violation that's been going on, and I think that the Senate did not get as deep as they should have. So I would like to see them go on, and we certainly should not support the Contra. That really infuriates me. It's not American at all.
I think it went as far as it could go in the public domain as it was televised, but I think there ought to be continued investigations, yes.
I think it was more of a token gesture to make people, you know, at least see that there is some investigation going on, but I think to really get involved deeply in it, there would have to be much more of an investigation.
It's probably time to get rid of the Security Council, which has turned into a secret government. And perhaps that's one of the most important things we should do, and ask presidential candidates about it.
Seems as though this began with the National Security Act in 1947, and what would his feeling be as to whether that should be repealed? I'm not all that familiar with the act itself, but Bill Moyers mentioned last night that was the beginning of all this, and that every president since then has really been a part of a secret government.
So I think more than anything else, our foreign policy for the last maybe 20 years has been mostly under the table and covert actions.
I do not agree. I find it very frightening. I find it the kind of thing that undermines the Constitution, what the American people think, the kind of system they're living under. I think it's very scary.
Covert activities just goes on all the time. You know, Casey was an old boy. He did stuff the old way, you know, the way that you do it back in turn of the century around Mata Hari stuff and all that kind of. That's the way they did. Everything was covert, and everything still is covert. I think the public is kind of maybe naive to think that it doesn't go on that way.
When Senator Warren Rudman said that this was the gang that couldn't shoot straight, I found that incomparably disgusting and revolting. He was trying to sell us the fairy tale that this was, oh, well, just a mistake by a bunch of Alec Guinness-type guys who couldn't get their routine straight. That is an unmitigated lie. This gang couldn't shoot straight, but also let us not forget the fact that this gang was more or less a criminal cabal. And anyone who would think that Oliver North is a hero has a very, very bad case of Reaganitis, because this is absolute nonsense. This is what dictatorships do. They're always selling you a hero or a man on horseback. It was Napoleon III who said what this country needs is a man on horseback.
We will take the first question. May I have your silence? Thank you. I'm going to read the question, and then Dan will answer it in his own manner, although I will urge that the answers be short, even though the questions have very long implications. The first is one that probably has been going through the minds of some of you, is, are you, Dan Sheehan, afraid of being assassinated, and have you been harassed by the U.S. government?
Well, actually, there was a $100,000 contract that was put out on us at the Christic Institute if we did not agree to not come down to Miami to investigate this case anymore, to file or prosecute the case. Our chief investigator found out who it was that had put out this contract and visited the man with a number of other associates, explaining to him that this was a very bad idea. And the man acknowledged that he had done that and said that he was withdrawing the $100,000 contract. Now, the fact of the matter is that many people have raised this question about whether or not we fear for our lives at the Institute. The people that we're dealing with are a very sophisticated group of men. Richard Secord, Theodore Shackley are not fools. Rafael Chichi-Quintero is not a fool. He is an ideologue. And he believes in the things he believes in very firmly. And they realize that they have many arrows in their quiver, and that they can rely upon the legal system for something to occur that would keep us from presenting all of the evidence in court. But mostly they believe that the American people are not going to rise up and support this activity. They believe that the American people are going to be too busy raising their families and doing their jobs and going about their life as normal, and that we are not going to be able to raise the public support to put the type of pressure on the congressional representatives to demand that a full-scale investigation be conducted. They are also convinced that the American people are not going to put up the type of financial assistance that is necessary to see to it that this type of case succeeds. Because while each one of us at the Christic Institute earns only $15,000 a year, we have to hire professional investigators who would cost $500 a day in the field. We have to pay for depositions approximately $2,000 apiece, to pay for the videotapes and for the stenographic record. And as you know, we're a tax-exempt organization that relies solely upon the contributions from citizens. And so these men are very sophisticated, and they realize that for us to take 300 depositions between now and June of 1988, when the trial is scheduled to begin, that it is going to be a major financial undertaking, and that they believe that we will not succeed in gaining the support of the American people. And they also believe that unless the national media begin to take up this cause, that people will simply not hear about it. And so therefore, we are undertaking to resort to you to get the videotapes of this presentation, to get the other videotapes of our presentations. You can buy them at cost out here, and you can dub them. We have no little things at the beginning that says that the FBI will come and get you. You see? And so you can dub as many of these as you want and send them to your friends and neighbors. I thought this morning it would be a good idea to send them with your Christmas cards to all those people that you only write to once a year. And send them a gift and say, in light of the Christmas season, why don't you sit down and look at this with your friends? And you can have local house gatherings to show copies of the videotapes. Also get a copy of Bill Moyer's 90-minute documentary that he did on November 4th of 1987 on the public broadcasting system, and show your friends and neighbors that. Because while they may not believe it if the Christic Institute says it, they will believe it if Bill Moyers says it. In the same way that we worked hard in the Karen Soakwood case to bring it to a motion picture where people could see this. And in fact, it's true that we said Kerr McGee may be able to get away with killing Karen Soakwood, but they cannot get away with killing Merle Streep. And that's the kind of thing that has to go out. Show them these videotapes, organize your friends and neighbors, and that is the way to protect us. We cannot be protected with guns and armor and hide out from these people. We rely upon you for our protection, and we pray that you will respond accordingly.
Another question, in the event that Congress stops funding the Contras, what would be the activities of the secret team to perpetuate the Contras as a military force?
Well, the fact of the matter is that they are preparing for that now, because they suspect that you are going to rise up and cut off the funding for the Contras. And so they are now preparing a 1,200-man Nicaraguan indigenous force, which is being trained in Belize now by people who were trained in the Mayo tribe, who are now down there. They're attempting to form a backup group to avoid all the mercenaries and drug smugglers and all that type of thing, and just organize and train this indigenous force and put them into Nicaragua to form low-intensity combat units, to wage an indigenous guerrilla war against the Sandinistas, and to hide the hand of the United States a little more carefully this time. That is, in fact, what they are doing at the present time as we speak, and that will be their fallback position when you cut off the aid to the Contras.
This is a question in regard to former General John Singlaub's activities. Does he now reside in the Philippines? What is he doing there? And what can you tell us about the role of the secret team in that part of the country, the world?
Well, General John Singlaub is in the Philippines hunting for buried treasure. You don't believe that? Well, you see, he was taken with a great urge to search for buried treasure immediately after he was named as a defendant in our case. And he went to the Philippines, where he rides around in a major ship decked out with massive amounts of sophisticated electronic gear. And he was meeting with members of the military, having a peculiar bent to the right, and with people who are now forming death squads in the Philippines.